Chapter 1. The Beginnings of Prussia, the Territory and the Prussian Tribes. The history of Prussia begins in the centuries before Christianization, when the area that later formed the core of the Prussian state was inhabited by various Baltic tribes. These tribes, commonly known as Prussians or Prussians, were part of the West Baltic group and were distinguished by their own language, culture, and social organization. The country stretched along the southern coast of the Baltic Sea, from the Numinus in the north to the Vistula in the west, and was characterized by a mixture of coastal plains, riverscapes, and dense forests that provided both shelter and resources for the early inhabitants. Prussian society was tribal, with local princes and chieftains determining political decisions and exercising authority over small communities of families or villages. The defining features of this early Prussian society were its close ties to nature, its agriculture, and its military organization. The Prussians practiced agriculture, livestock breeding, and fishing, and used the forests for hunting and timber industry. At the same time, they were known as a warrior society that was in constant readiness to defend their territories against neighboring tribes or immigrants. Their military structure was decentralized, with each tribe or village association providing its own warriors who joined forces in conflicts. This independent but flexible organization made the Prussians a difficult society to conquer, but it was also vulnerable to outside influences, especially from the emerging powers from the West, which pushed into the region in the course of Christianization and expansion. The political landscape of this time was highly fragmented. No single tribe could assert dominance over the entire area, and power was distributed locally. Social hierarchies were relatively flat, with chiefs or small noble families taking the lead but relying heavily on community approval. Decisions were often made collectively, especially on issues of war, trade, and alliances. These structures allowed for a high degree of autonomy, but made it difficult to create a unified political entity that could serve as a basis for later states. The cultural identity of the Prussians was closely linked to their religion and customs. They worshipped a variety of gods closely associated with natural phenomena and agricultural cycles, and cultivated rites that emphasized both communal and individual aspects of life. Sanctuaries were often located in geographically prominent locations, such as hills, riverbanks, or forests, which underlined the spiritual connection to the environment. Festivals, offerings, and rituals were central elements of social life and served to strengthen community, morality, and identity. At the same time, there were close trade contacts and cultural exchange relations with neighboring Baltic and Slavic peoples, which supported the development of their own material and spiritual culture. Prussia's geographical location played a decisive role in its early development. The proximity to the Baltic Sea opened up trade opportunities, but also brought threats from seafarers and later the expansionist policy of the Teutonic Order. Rivers such as the Memel, the Pregel, and the Vistula served as transport routes, but also as natural lines of defense. The forests offered protection against raids, but also made military coordination over longer distances more difficult. This natural environment shaped the adaptability and resilience of the Prussian tribes, who were both locally rooted and flexible in military and political organization. The first contacts with Western Christianity and European powers were mostly marked by trade or diplomacy initiatives, but quickly became a starting point for conflicts. Missionaries, merchants, and later the Teutonic Order entered the region to Christianize the population, exert political influence, and secure trade relations. The Prussians initially resisted these influences, with the combination of military skill and decentralized organization allowing them to preserve their cultural identity. These disputes laid the foundation for the later confrontation with the Teutonic Order and the transformation of the region into a centralized political structure. The early Prussian settlements, castles, and villages were often built on defensive principles, with rivers, hills, and forests serving as natural protective barriers. Residential buildings were made of wood and clay, while larger community structures provided space for gatherings, rituals, and military organization. Economic self-sufficiency and local trade networks enabled a certain independence, which made the Prussians resilient in conflicts but also increased political fragmentation. In summary, the early Prussian tribes formed a society characterized by flexibility, resilience, and deep roots in nature and culture. Political fragmentation, military organization at the tribal level, and a rich spiritual and material culture laid the foundation for Prussia's later development. Conflicts with Western powers and the influences of the Teutonic Order were to profoundly change the region over the next centuries, but the foundations, strength, adaptability, and cultural identity were already firmly anchored in this early phase and determined the character of the future Prussian state. Chapter 2. The Teutonic Order and the Christianization of Prussia, 13th century. In the 13th century, a profound change in the political, social, and cultural structures in the territory of today's Prussian states began when the Teutonic Order advanced into the region. The Teutonic Order, a military religious order of knights originally founded in the Holy Land, pursued the goal of Christianizing pagan territories, exercising political control, and securing territorial power. The Prussian tribes, which had lived independently and decentralized for centuries, were now faced with an existential challenge. On the one hand, they had to defend their traditional way of life, religion, and social structure, and on the other hand, they were faced with a militarily superior and organizationally disciplined power that had resources, strategic skills, and support throughout the Christian world. The arrival of the Teutonic Order was not accidental, but part of a longer-term plan aimed at securing Christian supremacy in the Baltic Sea region. The order had already gained experience in military campaigns in the Holy Land and brought this tactical discipline, organizational efficiency, and strategic planning to the Baltic region. The conquest of the Prussian tribes was divided into several campaigns, in which castles and fortified settlements were systematically attacked, encircled, and conquered. The order used both military force and diplomatic means, making treaties with individual chiefs, buying loyalty, and using the Christian religion as a means of integration. Christianization was a central part of the order's ruling policy. Missionaries accompanied the military campaigns to baptize the population in the conquered territories and establish Christian institutions. Churches, monasteries, and parish structures were built to spread Christian doctrine and to integrate the population ideologically. At the same time, the order used education, justice, and administration to stabilize its rule. This led to a profound change in social structures. Tribal leaders, who had once been able to make autonomous decisions, were now integrated into the order's hierarchical system, rewarding loyalty and obedience but punishing resistance. The military organization of the Teutonic Order played a decisive role in the success of Christianization. The order had trained knights, infantry, and supporting mercenary troops operating in coordinated formation. Castles were used not only as defensive fortifications, but also as administrative centers from which military and religious control was exercised. This combination of military presence and institutional administration made it possible to subjugate the Prussian tribes step by step without the need for complete destruction of the population. At the same time, the construction of castles and fortified bases served long-term control, as they were strategically positioned along rivers, trade routes, and important transport hubs. The resistance of the Prussian tribes was massive at first. Numerous uprisings, guerrilla actions, and coordinated attacks on castles of the order testified to the resilience of the population. The tribes used their knowledge of the terrain, forests, and rivers to lay ambushes and challenge the order. These conflicts led to protracted battles in which the order was forced to adapt its tactics, organize reinforcements, and consider strategic retreat options. Despite this resistance, the order managed to gain the upper hand through systematic action, the use of diplomacy, and the use of Christian networks. The Christianization and political integration of the Prussian territories also had profound cultural consequences. The introduction of Christianity led to a change in religious practices, the legal systems, and the education systems. Old pagan rituals, festivals, and social norms were either abolished or transferred to Christian contexts. At the same time, schools, monasteries, and educational institutions were built, which imparted the knowledge and ideals of the order and permanently changed the cultural identity of the region. This process was not only a religious transformation, but also an instrument of political stabilization and long-term integration into the European power structure. The economic structures have also been adjusted. Under the rule of the order, trade was more regulated, taxes were introduced, and agricultural structures were reorganized to ensure a stable supply of castles and settlements. Control over trade routes and resources enabled the order to stabilize the region economically and expand its power base. At the same time, this offered the local inhabitants new opportunities to integrate into the order system, to engage in trade, or to take advantage of opportunities for social advancement. In summary, it can be said that the 13th century represented a fundamental turning point for the region. Through military superiority, religious mission, and administrative control, the Teutonic Order created the basis for the emergence of the later Prussian state. Christianization was not only a religious, but a political and cultural transformation process that permanently changed the social structures, the economy, and the cultural identity of the Prussians. Despite initial resistance and repeated uprisings, the order managed to integrate the Prussian tribes, paving the way for later consolidation, territorial expansion, and political stability. The measures of the Teutonic Order thus laid the decisive foundations for the later development of Prussia as a centralized, powerful state in the European context.
Chapter 3. The Rise of the Margraviate of Brandenburg and the Integration of Prussia, 15th–16th centuries. In the 15th and 16th centuries, a new phase in the history of Prussia began, which was characterized by the increasing importance of the Margraviate of Brandenburg and its dynastic connection with the Prussian territories. While the Teutonic Order ruled the southern parts of Prussia and Christianization was largely completed, political structures developed in the west and south that were to form the basis for the emerging Prussian state in the long term. The Margraviate of Brandenburg, a territory within the Holy Roman Empire, was of strategic importance as it acted as a bridge between Western and Eastern Europe and offered both military and economic power potential. The dynastic connection with Prussia and the gradual integration of the territories created a political unit that was to have a decisive influence on Prussia's later rise. The integration of Prussia into the political structure of the Mark Brandenburg initially took place through personal and dynastic unions. In 1410, the Hohenzollerns, who ruled as electors of the Margraviate of Brandenburg, acquired control of parts of the Duchy of Prussia, which had previously been under the supremacy of the Teutonic Order, through clever marriage policies and political alliances. This connection was initially symbolic, but it laid the foundation for increasingly closer political and military integration. The Hohenzollerns used their position to integrate Prussia more closely into the Holy Roman Empire, to standardize administration, legal system, and economic structures, and to bundle the power of the nobility. The political consolidation was accompanied by economic measures that improved the stability of the region. The Hohenzollerns introduced uniform tax systems, strengthened the trade routes between Brandenburg and Prussia, and promoted agriculture, especially grain production, which became an important export good. Trading cities such as Königsberg gained in importance as they acted as hubs for maritime trade and the connection between the Baltic Sea and the interior. This economic integration was crucial to secure the political authority of the Hohenzollerns and to transform Prussia into a functioning, contiguous territory. The military organization also played a central role. The Hohenzollerns began to develop a standing army that was used both to defend the territory and to enforce political control over local nobles and urban centers of power. This military structure differed from the decentralized tribal armies of early Prussia and allowed conflicts to be resolved more quickly and territorial unity to be secured. At the same time, the dynasty used military clout to assert its interests in relations with the Teutonic Order and other regional powers. Culturally and religiously, the 15th and 16th centuries were a time of transformation. The Hohenzollerns continued to promote Christianization in the western areas of Prussia and supported the construction of churches, schools, and monasteries to ensure religious and social integration. At the same time, the political reforms contributed to the formation of a common sense of identity that connected the population of Brandenburg and Prussia more closely. This cultural consolidation was an important factor in the long-term stability and legitimacy of the Hohenzollern rule. An important milestone in this phase was the Reformation. The introduction of Protestant doctrines in the 16th century, especially in Brandenburg, had far-reaching effects on Prussia. The Hohenzollerns adopted the Protestant confession and used religious unity to strengthen control over church resources, education, and administration. This Reformation led not only to religious homogenization, but also to a closer connection between political and spiritual power, which allowed the Hohenzollerns to further consolidate their rule. At the same time, they had to overcome the resistance of conservative forces within the nobility and the population, which required political skill and diplomatic sensitivity. Diplomatic relations with neighboring powers were another decisive factor. Brandenburg-Prussia had to assert itself against the Teutonic Order, Poland, and other German territories. Through skillful marriages, alliances, and negotiations, the Hohenzollerns succeeded in securing territorial integrity, minimizing rivalries, and achieving long-term strategic advantages. This ability to combine political, military, and diplomatic means laid the foundation for Prussia's eventual rise to become a centralized, powerful European state power. In summary, the 15th and 16th centuries were a time of consolidation, integration, and transformation for Prussia. The dynastic connection with the Margraviate of Brandenburg, the economic and military organization, the cultural and religious unity, as well as the diplomatic skill of the Hohenzollerns created the conditions for the later rise of Prussia. From the fragmented territories of former tribal landscapes and religious states, a politically stable entity emerged that was able to expand its power within the Holy Roman Empire and gain long-term influence in Central Europe. This period laid the foundation for the central role that Prussia would play in the centuries that followed, and made it clear that dynasty, organization, and strategic foresight were crucial to the development of a modern state.
Chapter 4. The Duchy of Prussia under the Hohenzollerns, 1525, marked a decisive turning point in the history of Prussia. The former state of the order, which had been under the Teutonic Order for centuries, became a secular principality, the first of its kind in Northern Europe. This change took place under Albrecht of Brandenburg-Ansbach, the last Grand Master of the Teutonic Order, who transformed the order's territory into a secular duchy after the Reformation and accepted Luther's teachings. Through this transformation, Prussia became a hereditary territory under the sovereignty of Poland, which brought with it both new political freedoms and long-term dependencies. The political, economic, and social developments in this phase laid the foundation for the later consolidation and expansion of Prussian power. Albrecht of Brandenburg-Ansbach took over the government in a difficult environment. The country was structurally weakened by centuries of wars with native tribes, Christianization, and the influence of the Teutonic Order. The population was fragmented, urban structures were still developing, and the rural regions were only weakly administratively organized. Albrecht used the opportunity of the Reformation to break away from the religious and military control of the order, to transform the duchy into a Protestant principality, and at the same time to secure political legitimacy through recognition by the Polish king. This combination of religious transformation, political consolidation, and dynastic security was central to establishing the rule of the Hohenzollerns. The Reformation played a central role in the development of the duchy. The introduction of the Lutheran faith not only changed the religious structure, but also consolidated political power. Church property, monasteries, and church revenues were nationalized or brought under the control of the ducal administration. This redistribution of resources strengthened the economic basis of the new duchy and made it possible to finance administration, military, and infrastructure. At the same time, the Reformation promoted education and literacy, as churches and schools disseminated Lutheran principles and created a coherent cultural identity. Religious unity helped to stabilize the population, generate loyalty, and transform the duchy into a modern political entity. Economically, the Duchy of Prussia was dependent on the establishment of stable structures. Trade, especially in port cities such as Königsberg, was expanded to ensure income and supplies. Agricultural reforms and the regulation of production created a reliable basis for the livelihood of the population and the financing of the state administration. At the same time, the Reformation promoted education and literacy, as churches and schools disseminated Lutheran principles and created a coherent cultural identity. Religious unity helped to stabilize the population, generate loyalty, and transform the duchy into a modern political entity. Economically, the Duchy of Prussia was dependent on the establishment of stable structures. Trade, especially in port cities such as Königsberg, was expanded to ensure income and supplies. Agricultural reforms and the regulation of production created a reliable basis for the livelihood of the population and the financing of the state administration. At the same time, castle complexes and defensive structures were modernized to ensure military security and protect the duchy against external threats, especially from Poland or neighboring German territories. This strategic combination of economic, military, and administrative stability laid the foundation for the country's growth and consolidation. Politically, the Duchy of Prussia was characterized by its dependence on the Polish king. The Hohenzollerns had to secure their status as feudal lords and recognize the sovereignty of Poland, which gave them territorial independence within the region but limited foreign policy and military autonomy. This balance between internal sovereignty and external dependence shaped the political culture of the duchy by making diplomatic skill, alliances, and negotiations central instruments of power. The Hohenzollerns developed strategies to secure loyalty, balance Poland's influence, and at the same time consolidate rule in the country. Socially, the transformation of the religious state into a secular duchy led to far-reaching changes. The population had to get used to new power structures, administration, and legal systems. Cities were given greater autonomy to organize trade and administration efficiently, while rural areas were more integrated into ducal control. This institutional development promoted centralization and created the conditions for coherent political unity. At the same time, social tensions between urban and rural regions, between nobility and citizens, and between old members of the order and new reform structures were alleviated by cautious political measures. The duchy's foreign policy focused on securing its position vis-à-vis neighbors, forming diplomatic alliances, and stabilizing its own territorially limited power in the long term. Trade relations with the Baltic Sea region, political contact with German principalities, and coordination with Poland made it possible to ensure the security and economic development of the duchy. This strategic foresight was crucial to maintain the integrity of the country and preparing for future expansion. In summary, the period from 1525 to 1618 was decisive for the transformation of Prussia. The Duchy of Prussia under the Hohenzollerns developed from a fragile, militarily and administratively weak religious state into a secularized Protestant principality with a stable administration, economic basis, and cultural identity. The combination of dynastic legitimacy, military organization, economic stability, religious unity, and diplomatic skill laid the foundation for Prussia's eventual consolidation, expansion, and the central role it would play in Central Europe.
This phase made it clear that political vision, organizational discipline, and strategic thinking are crucial to transform a fragmented territory into a stable and effective state.
Chapter 5. The Personal Union with Brandenburg and the 30 Years' War, 1618–1648. In 1618, a decisive phase in the history of Prussia began, when the Duchy of Prussia came under the rule of the Hohenzollerns through the personal union with the Margraviate of Brandenburg. This dynastic connection, which went back to the succession of Joachim Friedrich, Elector of Brandenburg, united two politically and geographically different territories under one ruler. The Duchy of Prussia was a relatively small but strategically important stretch of land on the southern Baltic coast, while Brandenburg, as an important territory in the Holy Roman Empire, had a larger population, economic resources, and military potential. The personal union formed the basis for a central development of power, which enabled the Hohenzollerns to secure influence, stability, and territorial cohesion in the long term, although the two territories initially remained legally and administratively separate. At the same time as this dynastic connection, the 30 Years' War began, one of the most devastating conflicts in European history, which affected the entire Holy Roman Empire and neighboring regions, including Prussia. The war, which arose from religious tensions between Catholics and Protestants, as well as political power conflicts within the empire, posed enormous challenges for the Duchy and Brandenburg. Prussia was particularly exposed due to its geographical location, as it was located between the warring powers and had to experience both troop movements and looting. The personal union with Brandenburg meant that the Hohenzollerns now had to bear responsibility for defense, political stability, and supplies for the population in both areas. The political effects of the personal union during the war were complex. Although Prussia and Brandenburg remained formally separate, the common dynastic interests led to coordinated administration and political action. The Hohenzollerns had to ensure the loyalty of local nobles, city governments, and citizens in order to cope with the burdens of war. This required political skill, as the population was heavily burdened by recruitment, taxes, and confiscations. At the same time, diplomatic relations with neighboring states, the Kaiser, and other warring parties had to be maintained in order to minimize territorial losses and secure political freedom for the Hohenzollerns. Militarily, Prussia was severely affected, although the duchy did not have the resources and troop strength of Brandenburg. The region was repeatedly plagued by marches, occupations, and looting. Cities such as Königsberg and Danzig were strategically important and at the same time targets of warring powers, causing economic and infrastructural damage. The Hohenzollerns had to deploy military units, form alliances, and establish defensive structures to protect the population and maintain territorial integrity. The experience of the 30 Years' War highlighted the need to use military resources efficiently, organize local defense forces, and involve the population in the defense process. The social impact of the war was dramatic. Looting, food shortages, and disease led to a significant loss of population in both territories. Many villages were abandoned, urban structures weakened, and trade came to a temporary standstill. The population had to adapt to new power structures and military pressures, which put social cohesion to the test. At the same time, the pressures of the war led to a closer connection between the dynastic rule of the Hohenzollerns and the subjects, as loyalty, protection, and administration became central factors of political stability during this period of crisis. The economic consequences of the war were felt in the long term. Agricultural production, crafts, and trade suffered from the constant movements of troops, contributions, and looting. At the same time, the Hohenzollerns had to adapt the administration in order to secure revenues, collect taxes, and ensure the supply of armies and the population. The personal union offered advantages here, as resources and administrative capacities could be coordinated between Brandenburg and Prussia.
At the same time, the war provided an incentive to reform economic structures, secure trade routes, and rebuild local markets in order to lay the foundations for later stabilization and expansion. Culturally, the phase from 1618 to 1648 was characterized by uncertainty and adaptation. The population had to deal with the consequences of war, looting, and power shifts, while at the same time, religious differences were intensified by the effects of the 30 Years' War. The Hohenzollerns promoted unity through Protestantism in both areas, which helped to generate loyalty and create a common identity. At the same time, education, church structures, and administration were used to strengthen cultural coherence and promote the long-term integration of Prussia and Brandenburg. The long-term significance of the personal union and the 30 Years' War lies in the consolidated rule of the Hohenzollerns. Despite extreme stresses, territorial threats, and economic destruction, the dynastic connection was able to lay the foundation for a centralized, effective administration that later enabled Prussia's rise to become a major European power. The experiences during the war taught the Hohenzollerns to use military and political resources efficiently, to shape diplomatic relations strategically, and to stabilize the population in times of extreme stress. In summary, it can be said that the phase from 1618 to 1648 was decisive for the later development of Prussia. The personal union with Brandenburg connected two geographically and politically different territories that were challenged by the 30 Years' War and laid the foundation for centralized dynastic rule. Political skill, military organization, economic adaptation, and cultural unity enabled the Hohenzollerns to create a stable base despite external threats and internal tensions. This period showed that strategic foresight, dynastic continuity, and the ability to manage crises are crucial for the long-term rise of a state.
Chapter 6. Restoration and Consolidation of Prussia after the 30 Years' War, 1648 to 1688. The 30 Years' War left Prussia in a desolate state, both economically and socially. The years from 1618 to 1648 had left deep traces in the cities, villages, and rural areas. The population was severely decimated, the infrastructure destroyed, and the economic structures destabilized. After the Peace of Westphalia of 1648, a phase of restoration and consolidation began, in which the Hohenzollerns, as rulers of Brandenburg-Prussia, laid the foundations for a centralized, stable, and capable state. This period was marked by the reconstruction of administration, economy, military organization, and social order, in which the experiences of the war and the lessons of personal union played a decisive role. Political consolidation was at the heart of the restoration efforts. The Hohenzollerns used their dynastic position to make the administration more efficient, to harmonize local power structures, and to secure the loyalty of the population. This was done by centralizing power in the hands of the elector, creating a functioning bureaucracy, and establishing jurisdictions that increased legal certainty. Cities were given clearly defined privileges and administrative powers, while rural areas were integrated into the central system of rule through the control of the nobility and the introduction of tax structures. These measures stabilized the political order and laid the foundation for effective taxation and legislation, which later supported the military and economic strength of the state. Economically, reconstruction was a central challenge. Many agricultural areas had been destroyed or neglected by acts of war. The trade routes were unsafe and the cities were badly damaged. The Hohenzollerns specifically promoted the restoration of agriculture, trade, and crafts. They granted tax breaks for rebuilt villages, supported the settlement of craftsmen and merchants, and invested in the reconstruction of cities, roads, and port facilities. The economic recovery was closely linked to the stabilization of the population, as securing food, employment, and trade was crucial to prevent social discontent and immigration. At the same time, trade with the Baltic Sea, Poland, and the German territories was expanded, whereby Prussia regained a foothold as an economically integrated part of the Central German trade network. Militarily, a strong and disciplined army was built up after the war, which was able to secure the territorial integrity of Prussia and ward off future conflicts. The Hohenzollerns relied on recruiting from their own population, supplemented by soldiers from neighboring areas, and introduced a central administration of the troops. Fortifications, castles, and defenses were renewed and modernized, especially at strategically important points along the borders and on the coasts of the Baltic Sea. The military organization was not only aimed at defense, but also served to control the internal order and enforce central rule. This strengthened the position of the Hohenzollerns as sovereign rulers and prepared the ground for later military expansions. Socially, the effects of the war and the Restoration were profound. The population had to adapt to new administrative structures, tax regulations, and legal systems. At the same time, social conflicts were mitigated by the Hohenzollerns introducing certain privileges and protective measures for cities, merchants, and craftsmen. The population benefited from the promotion of reconstruction and economic stability, while at the same time a stronger loyalty to dynastic rule emerged. The Hohenzollerns took advantage of the need for reconstruction to bind the population more closely to the state and to promote a collective identity based on dynastic legitimacy, central administration, and religious affiliation. Culturally and religiously, the Hohenzollerns used the phase of consolidation to further consolidate Protestant structures. Schools, churches, and educational institutions were rebuilt or newly established to spread the teachings of the Reformation and strengthen the cultural unity of the country. Religious consolidation not only contributed to social stability, but also supported political authority, as the church acted as an intermediary between ruler and population, promoting loyalty and social order. The foreign policy strategy after the war was carefully diplomacy and territorial security. Prussia and Brandenburg had to consolidate its position vis-à-vis Poland, Sweden, and neighboring German territories. Through skillful marriages, alliances, and negotiations, the Hohenzollerns succeeded in stabilizing the borders, securing Prussia's autonomy within the personal union, and at the same time strengthening Brandenburg's reputation in the Reich. This foreign policy foresight was crucial to avoid future conflicts and lay the foundation for gradual expansion. In summary, the period from 1648 to 1688 was a phase of decisive stabilization and consolidation for Prussia. The reconstruction of the administration, economy, military organization, and society created the conditions for the later development into a centralized state capable of acting. The Hohenzollerns used the lessons of the 30 Years' War, the dynastic connection with Brandenburg, and the strategic location of Prussia to consolidate the political, economic, and social order. This phase demonstrated that a state after profound destruction by war can only be rebuilt and permanently stabilized through coordinated measures in administration, military, economy, and culture. After this phase, Prussia was ready to further expand its position as a centralized power in Northern and Central Europe and to pave the way for its rise under the Great Elector and later rulers.
Chapter 7. Reforms and Developments in Prussia in the 17th Century. The second half of the 17th century was a phase of far-reaching reforms and structural developments for Prussia, which laid the foundation for the later development of power. After the destruction and burdens of the 30 Years' War, reconstruction was complete, but the Hohenzollerns recognized that a sustainable rise of Prussia could only be ensured by a comprehensive modernization of the administration, the military, the economy, and social structures. The reforms included both the consolidation of central power and the targeted promotion of infrastructure, trade, education, and military efficiency, which allowed Prussia to stabilize its position within the Holy Roman Empire and vis-à-vis neighboring powers.
Politically, the focus was on strengthening central authority. The Hohenzollerns used the experience of the 30 Years' War to consolidate their rule, secure the loyalty of the local nobles, and professionalize the administration. Regional nobles were more closely integrated into the central system of government, with their traditional privileges partially recognized but at the same time restricted by the requirements of the ducal administration. Civil servant structures were created that allowed for efficient tax collection, jurisdiction, and administration, consolidating dynastic power and strengthening the political coherence of the territory. At the same time, the judiciary was centralized, which facilitated the enforcement of laws and systematically regulated local disputes. Militarily, the reform of the armed forces was of decisive importance. The Hohenzollerns introduced an organized, standing army that was no longer based solely on aristocratic war mobs, but was centrally administered, trained, and equipped with clear hierarchies. This reform increased the effectiveness and discipline of the troops, which were used both for territorial defense and to enforce internal rule. Fortifications, castles, and cities were modernized, and strategically important border regions were reinforced to ward off external threats. The military reform reflected the awareness that Prussia could only secure its sovereignty and achieve political ambitions through an effective and centralized organization of troops. Economically, Prussia focused on the restoration and expansion of agriculture, the promotion of crafts, and the strengthening of trade. The Hohenzollerns supported the settlement of specialists, merchants, and craftsmen in order to broaden the economic base and increase productivity. Agricultural reforms aimed at more efficient use of land, better irrigation, and the introduction of new techniques to increase yields. Trade relations, especially via the Baltic Sea and the connection to Poland and the German territories, were intensified, which not only made Prussia more economically stable, but also allowed it to act as part of a larger regional trade network. This economic strengthening supported the financing of the administration and the military and contributed to social stabilization. Socially, the reforms led to a stronger integration of the population into the structures of the duchy. Cities were given more autonomy and at the same time were more closely integrated into central administrative processes. The promotion of education, especially through the establishment of Protestant schools and the integration of Reformed teachings, contributed to cultural coherence and supported loyalty to the dynasty. At the same time, social tensions have been alleviated by targeted measures such as tax breaks, settlement programs, and protective provisions. The combination of religious unity, administrative control, and economic promotion strengthened social stability and laid the foundation for the emergence of a coherent Prussian identity. The reforms also had a diplomatic component. Prussia had to assert itself in the context of the Holy Roman Empire and against neighboring states such as Poland, Sweden, and Denmark. Through skillful marriages, alliances, and diplomatic agreements, the Hohenzollerns were able to secure their position, stabilize borders, and protect territorial interests. This foreign policy skill was closely linked to domestic reforms, as political stability, economic resources, and military strength formed the basis for successful negotiations and strategic alliances. Culturally and religiously, Prussia's Protestant identity was consolidated during this period. Churches, educational institutions, and public institutions were systematically expanded and used to create a common cultural and ideological basis. The combination of political, economic, and religious stability helped to promote loyalty and a sense of community, and legitimize the dynasty in the long term. This cultural coherence supported centralized reforms and facilitated the implementation of state measures in all areas of society. In summary, it can be said that the reforms of the 17th century were decisive for the transformation of Prussia. Through political centralization, military professionalization, economic promotion, and cultural integration, the Hohenzollerns created the foundations for a stable state capable of acting. This phase prepared Prussia for the coming expansions, military challenges, and the increasing importance in Central Europe. The reforms showed that sustainable state success depends on the combination of political, military, economic, and cultural measures, and that a coherent vision and strategic foresight are the prerequisites for the long-term rise of power. Chapter 8: The Great Elector and the Expansion of the Prussian State. The reign of the Great Elector, Frederick William of Brandenburg, who ruled from 1640 to 1688, marked a decisive turning point in the history of Prussia. After the devastation of the 30 Years' War and the initial consolidation under his predecessors, he relied on a comprehensive modernization and centralization of the state, which was to make Prussia a European power capable of acting in the long term. Frederick William understood that military strength, economic stability, efficient administration, and political control were inextricably linked, and shaped his rule accordingly. The measures he took laid the foundation for Prussia's eventual rise to become a leading European state, demonstrating the importance of strategic foresight, organizational discipline, and dynastic continuity. One of the central achievements of the Great Elector was the strengthening of the central administration. Frederick William introduced an efficient system of civil servants and chanceries that unified tax collection, jurisdiction, and control over the widely scattered territories. The political power of the nobility was bound to a certain extent by recognizing their rights, but at the same time strengthening the ducal authority over military and administrative matters. This centralization allowed dynastic rule to be stabilized, which in turn facilitated the implementation of reforms and reconstruction after war and destruction. The administration became an instrument of state building, which not only consolidated political power, but also promoted economic efficiency and social order. Militarily, the expansion of the standing army was one of the most lasting achievements. Frederick William built up a disciplined, centrally organized army that was used not only to defend the borders, but also to assert central authority within the territories. The troops consisted of regular soldiers who were trained, equipped, and financed on a long-term basis, and were supported by a network of fortresses and strategic bases. This military structure served not only territorial security, but also the projection of power, which enabled the elector to control political opponents, conduct diplomatic negotiations on an equal footing, and secure Prussia's sovereignty vis-à-vis neighboring states. Economically, the Great Elector relied on targeted promotion of agriculture, trade, and crafts. Farmers received support to modernize their production methods, while trade and crafts were stimulated by privileges, tax breaks, and the creation of safe trade routes. The cities in particular, especially Königsberg and Berlin, benefited from this economic support, as they functioned as centers of trade, administration, and culture. The expansion of port facilities, roads, and transport routes not only facilitated trade, but also strengthened the economic interconnectedness of the territories and contributed to the long-term stability of the state. This economic consolidation formed the basis for the financing of military and administrative reforms, whereby the various state measures acted synergistically. Socially and culturally, Frederick William promoted a close connection between the state and the population. The settlement of religious refugees, especially Huguenots from France, contributed to economic revival and cultural diversification. These immigrants brought with them expertise, craftsmanship, and trade contacts that strengthened Prussia economically and expanded its administrative capacity. At the same time, the strengthening of Protestant institutions, schools, and churches promoted a common cultural identity that supported loyalty to the dynasty and social stability. The integration of different populations under centralized rule demonstrated the Great Elector's ability to combine social coherence and economic efficiency. Frederick William's foreign policy strategy was characterized by cautious diplomacy, alliances, and military deterrence. He knew how to shape relations with Poland, Sweden, Denmark, and the Holy Roman Empire in such a way that Prussia could protect its interests, secure borders, and create scope for future expansion. Through clever marriages, alliances, and negotiations, he managed to avoid conflicts or shape them in his favor, while military strength and administrative efficiency served as the basis for negotiation. The combination of political, economic, and military strategy made Prussia a respected player in Central Europe and prepared the ground for its later dominance under Frederick William I and Frederick the Great. In summary, it can be said that the reign of the Great Elector represents the decisive phase of the formation of the state of Prussia. Through the centralization of the administration, the professionalization of the military, economic promotion, and cultural integration, Frederick William created a stable, capable of acting, and resilient territory. The synergy of these reforms not only enabled the consolidation of the state after the devastation of the 30 Years' War, but also laid the strategic, economic, and political foundation for Prussia's rise to become a major European power. This phase clearly shows that the sustainable success of a state does not depend solely on military strength, but on the coordinated development of administration, economy, military, and society, supported by a clear dynastic vision and strategic foresight.
Chapter 9. Frederick I and the Kingship. The rise of Prussia to the king's power. The elevation of Prussia to royal power under Frederick I, who ruled from 1701 to 1713, marked a decisive turning point in Prussia's political history. Frederick I, previously Elector of Brandenburg and Duke of Prussia, used his dynastic position, diplomatic skill, and military resources to secure the title of king in the Duchy of Prussia. This coronation was not just a symbolic act, but a strategic tool to establish Prussia as a sovereign and recognized European state, legitimize dynastic rule, and strengthen influence within the Holy Roman Empire. The rise to the royal dignity was the result of decades of political consolidation, military professionalism, and economic stabilization that the Hohenzollerns had built up since the Great Elector. The political significance of the kingship was enormous. Frederick I was now able to appear in the international arena as a sovereign monarch, which facilitated negotiations with other European powers and strengthened Prussia's position as an independent power. At the same time, the kingship consolidated the internal order. The central power was symbolic and actually strengthened, as the elector now ruled as king over Brandenburg, Prussia, and the annexed territories. This increased the loyalty of nobility, officials, and citizens, as dynastic authority was now underpinned by royal rank. The recognition of the title by other European rulers required skillful diplomacy, which Frederick I mastered through marriages, alliances, and political compromises. Militarily, the royal dignity served both to demonstrate power and to practically secure the territories. Frederick I built on the standing army established by his father and the Great Elector and expanded the organization, discipline, and equipment of the troops. The army became a central instrument of rule, used not only to defend the country but also to enforce laws and control the population. By upgrading the military, Frederick I was able to ensure internal stability as well as demonstrate Prussia's position as a serious European power. At the same time, he used military reforms as a symbol of his royal authority, highlighting the connection between dynastic legitimacy, military strength, and political influence. Economically, Frederick I relied on the continuation of the modernization programs of his father and grandfather. Trade, crafts, and agriculture were specifically promoted in order to secure income for the administration, the military apparatus, and representative projects. Under his rule, the cities of Berlin and Königsberg in particular developed into economic and administrative centers that not only generated revenue, but also strengthened the cultural and political identity of the Kingdom of Prussia. Trade with the Baltic Sea states, the Holy Roman Empire, and other European powers was intensified, whereby Prussia stabilized its economic base and secured the financing of the military as well as the royal representation. The cultural dimension was of particular importance to Frederick I. As the first king of Prussia, he promoted pomp, art, architecture, and education to legitimize dynastic rule and give the impression of a sovereign, prestigious state.
The construction of magnificent palaces, the expansion of churches, the promotion of academies and artistic institutions served not only to represent the population, but also to integrate them culturally. These measures combined political power with cultural prestige and contributed to the formation of a coherent monarchical state system. Socially, the structure of Prussia changed under Frederick I as a result of the kingship and the reforms associated with it. The elite, consisting of the nobility, civil servants, and wealthy citizens, benefited from centralized administration, military advancement opportunities, and social stability, while the general population received an improved livelihood through economic promotion, infrastructure, and security. At the same time, the hierarchy between king, nobility, and population was strengthened, which promoted loyalty, discipline, and social coherence. This stability was crucial to secure the new state structures in the long term and to consolidate the rule of the Hohenzollerns. Frederick I's foreign policy strategy used the royal dignity to expand Prussia's influence in the European power structure. Through skillful diplomatic relations, participation in alliances, and recognition by other monarchies, Prussia was able to defend its interests against powerful neighbors such as Poland, Sweden, France, and the Holy Roman Emperor. The royal dignity made it possible to position Prussia not only as a regionally important power, but also as an independent actor in European conflicts and peace negotiations. In summary, it can be said that the reign of Frederick I and the attainment of the royal dignity of Prussia led to a new phase of state advancement. Political centralization, military professionalization, economic stabilization, cultural promotion, and diplomatic skill formed the basis for recognition as a royal power. Frederick I created the conditions for Prussia's later expansion, military glory, and political dominance in the 18th century, which was further expanded under his successors. This phase shows that sovereign state success is based on the combination of dynastic legitimacy, military strength, economic stabilization, and cultural prestige, whereby Prussia was permanently established as a central power in Central Europe.
Chapter 10. Frederick William I, the Soldier King and the Consolidation of Prussian Military Power. The reign of Frederick William I, who ruled from 1713 to 1740, is considered one of the most formative phases in Prussia's development into a modern military state. Frederick William I, often referred to as the Soldier King, understood that securing power, asserting central authority, and the rise of Prussia had to be based on a disciplined, well-organized army. His style of government was characterized by strictness, efficiency, and radical centralization, with military organization, administration, and economic planning closely intertwined. This phase laid the foundation for Prussia's military reputation, which was to reach its peak in the following decades under Frederick II the Great. Politically, Frederick William I strengthened the king's central power at the expense of the nobility, although he did not completely abolish their rights but controlled them. The government used an efficient system of officials and administrations to enforce laws, levy taxes, and secure the loyalty of local rulers. Through this centralization, the king was able to maintain internal order as well as create a basis for controlling the population and territorial units. Political structures were designed to support the military and economic goals of the monarchy, with administration, jurisdiction, and taxation coordinated and efficiently organized. Militarily, Frederick William I relied on a radical professionalization of the army. He significantly increased the number of troops, introduced a standing army, and standardized training, discipline, and equipment. The Prussian army became a central instrument of power projection, not only for the defense of the territory, but also for the enforcement of political authority at home. Soldiers were strictly controlled, hierarchically organized, and kept in special discipline structures, which significantly increased the efficiency and effectiveness of the troops. These military reforms formed the basis for Prussia's reputation as the army of the state, in which military discipline and organizational efficiency were closely linked to political power. Economically, Frederick William I specifically promoted measures that were intended to finance the army in the long term and stabilize the state. Agriculture, trade, and crafts were reorganized to secure the production of food, raw materials, and weapons. In particular, the promotion of crafts, the settlement of skilled workers, and the development of infrastructure, roads, and storage facilities supported military logistics. At the same time, tax systems have been optimized to reliably guarantee revenues for administration, military, and royal projects. These measures showed that economic stability and military efficiency are closely linked and enabled Prussia to build an above-average army despite limited resources. Socially, the emphasis on military discipline and central authority led to profound changes. The population was integrated into structures that promoted loyalty, order, and efficiency. Citizens, soldiers, and craftsmen were obliged to serve the state, with discipline, obedience, and a sense of duty being central values. This social order helped to push through reforms, ensure internal stability, and prepare the territory for future military and political challenges. The integration of the military, administration, and economy under a strict regime formed a coherent, efficient structure that was later to give the Prussians decisive advantages. Culturally and ideologically, Frederick William I supported his rule by promoting Protestant values, loyalty to the dynasty, and creating a collective sense of identity. Religion, education, and upbringing were used to strengthen discipline, obedience, and a sense of duty toward the monarchy. Schools and ecclesiastical institutions spread the principles of order and authority, while public rituals and military ceremonies made loyalty to the king and the state visible. This cultural coherence complemented the political and military structures and helped Prussia maintain a stable and resilient society despite harsh measures. Culturally and ideologically, Frederick William I supported his rule by promoting Protestant values, loyalty to the dynasty, and creating a collective identity. Religion, education, and upbringing were used to strengthen discipline, obedience, and a sense of duty toward the monarchy. Schools and ecclesiastical institutions spread the principles of order and authority, while public rituals and military ceremonies made loyalty to the king and the state visible. This cultural coherence complemented the political and military structures and helped Prussia maintain a stable and resilient society despite harsh measures. Culturally and ideologically, Frederick William I supported his rule by promoting Protestant values, loyalty to the dynasty, and creating a collective sense of identity. Religion, education, and upbringing were used to strengthen discipline, obedience, and a sense of duty toward the monarchy. Schools and ecclesiastical institutions spread the principles of order and authority, while public rituals and military ceremonies made loyalty to the king and the state visible. This cultural coherence complemented the political and military structures and helped Prussia maintain a stable and resilient society despite harsh measures. The foreign policy of Frederick William I was closely linked to military and economic strength. Through skillful diplomacy, marriages, alliances, and targeted neutrality, he was able to protect Prussia from direct military conflicts and, at the same time, secure the interests of the state. Military deterrence, economic stability, and central authority enabled Prussia to act confidently in negotiations and achieve strategic advantages. This far-sightedness in foreign policy prepared the ground for later expansions and Prussia's active role in European power constellations. In summary, it can be said that the reign of Frederick William I formed the basis for the transformation of Prussia into a centralized, militarily strong, and efficiently organized state. By combining political centralization, military professionalization, economic stability, and social coherence, the soldier king created the conditions for Prussia's future military and political dominance. His measures demonstrated that sustainable state success is based on strict discipline, strategic planning, and the integration of administration, military, business, and culture. Under Frederick William I, Prussia not only became the army of the state, but also laid the foundation for its later rise to become one of the leading European powers in the 18th century. Chapter 11. Frederick II, the Great, and the Expansion of Prussia. The reign of Frederick II, known as the Great, which lasted from 1740 to 1786, marked the culmination of Prussia's military, political, and cultural consolidation and led to a period of significant territorial expansion. Frederick II took over the government at a time when Prussia had already been established as an efficiently organized military state through the reforms of his grandfather, Frederick William I. He recognized that the further rise of Prussia was only possible through a combination of military strength, diplomatic skill, economic stability, and cultural legitimacy. Under his leadership, Prussia was not only territorially expanded, but also recognized as a European great power, with military, administrative, economic, and cultural connections in a strict, functional context. Politically, Frederick II focused on the centralization of state power and the consistent assertion of his authority. He understood that effective rule had to be ensured by both administrative efficiency and control over the aristocracy. Through a strong civil service system, standardized administrative units, and the upgrading of central institutions, Friedrich was able to ensure compliance with laws, tax obligations, and military service. Centralization served not only internal stability, but also the projection of power externally. Dynastic legitimacy was underlined by strict hierarchy, representative rituals, and the king himself as a symbol of state order, which strengthened both the loyalty of the population and the authority vis-à-vis European neighbors. Militarily, Frederick the Great was a master of strategic warfare. The Prussian army, which was already highly disciplined and professionally organized under Frederick William I, was further expanded, trained, and modernized. Frederick II used these troops not only to defend the country, but also to aggressively expand, relying on mobility, quick decisions, and surprising tactics. Especially during the First Silesian War, 1740 to 1742, and the Second Silesian War, 1744 to 1745, he demonstrated the ability to defeat numerically superior opponents through precise coordination, skillful deployment, and superior strategy. The Prussian military doctrine, characterized by discipline, speed, and organizational efficiency, became a model for other European armies. The territorial expansion under Frederick II had a considerable impact on Prussia's economic development. Through the conquest of Silesia, Prussia gained access to rich resources, especially ore and coal deposits, as well as industrial centers that significantly increased trade, production, and revenue. Frederick used these resources to further expand the administration, military, and infrastructure, and at the same time to secure Prussia's economic autonomy. Agriculture, crafts, and trade were specifically promoted, while new roads, canals, and trade routes were created to facilitate the integration of the new territories and stabilize prosperity in the long term. Socially, the reign of Frederick II led to a stronger connection between the state and the population. The introduction of reforms in the administration, military, and economy, as well as the promotion of education, science, and culture, helped to strengthen loyalty, efficiency, and identification with the Prussian dynasty. Frederick understood the importance of an educated civil service and officer apparatus that efficiently supported administrative and military structures, and promoted schools, academies, and cultural institutions to train qualified specialists. At the same time, he used culture, art, and philosophy as a means of legitimizing his rule and portraying Prussia as a progressive European great power. Culturally, Frederick II showed himself to be an enlightener. He promoted literature, philosophy, and science, and corresponded with leading thinkers such as Voltaire. These measures served not only personal self-realization, but also the representation of Prussia as a state that embodies rationality, discipline, and progress. At the same time, the promotion of culture and education strengthened social coherence and loyalty to the king, as the population was integrated into a system that combined political order, economic stability, and cultural values. In foreign policy, Frederick II led Prussia to become a recognized European power. Through strategic wars, diplomatic alliances, and skillful peace negotiations, he was able to expand Prussia's influence over the Holy Roman Empire and the surrounding powers. The annexation of Silesia and the successful leadership in the Seven Years' War showed Prussia's ability to combine territorial gain, military efficiency, and diplomatic recognition. This foreign policy strength made Prussia a central player in European politics and paved the way for further expansion and increasing dominance in the 19th century. In summary, it can be said that the reign of Frederick II, the Great, shaped Prussia into a recognized European great power. By combining military strength, administrative centralization, economic stability, cultural promotion, and diplomatic skill, Prussia was able not only territorially expanded, but also to consolidate its internal order and strengthen dynastic legitimacy. Frederick II demonstrated that sustainable state success is based on the close connection between the military, politics, business, and culture, and that strategic foresight, discipline, and efficient administration are crucial for the development of a power that is capable of acting and respected in the long term. Under his rule, Prussia achieved the status of a leading European state whose influence on the military, politics, and culture was felt far beyond the borders of the territory.
Chapter 12. The Prussian Wars of the 18th Century. The 18th century was an era of intensive military activities for Prussia, which decisively shaped the territorial expansion, political positioning, and military reputation of the state. Under the reign of Frederick II, the Great, Prussia became embroiled in a series of strategic conflicts that had not only military but also political and economic repercussions. These wars were both an expression of the Hohenzollerns' ambitions to expand Prussia's power and influence, as well as a reaction to the complex European power constellation in which Prussia had to maintain its position between Austria, France, Russia, and Poland. The events of this period demonstrate the close link between military, politics, diplomacy, and economic stability in the rise of Prussia. A central conflict was the First Silesian War, 1740 to 1742, which began immediately after Frederick II's accession to the throne. The strategic annexation of Silesia was a calculated step to strengthen Prussia's economic and political power. Silesia was rich in resources, especially agriculturally productive land and minerals, which expanded the economic foundation of Prussia. Frederick II took advantage of his grandfather's excellently trained, disciplined army and relied on fast, coordinated campaigns that surprised and overwhelmed his opponents. The war showed how military clout, strategic planning, and quick decisions could be combined to secure territorial gains and consolidate Prussia's political position in Central Europe. This was followed by the Second Silesian War, 1744 to 1745, in which Prussia defended its control of Silesia against Austria. This conflict cemented Prussia's military reputation, as Frederick II once again defeated a numerically superior army while using diplomatic alliances to strengthen his position. The successful defense of Silesia demonstrated not only military superiority, but also organizational efficiency, strategic thinking, and the ability to effectively coordinate resources and troops. Experience taught Prussia that long-term success is based on the combination of military prowess, administrative organization, and economic security. A high point of the Prussian Wars was the Seven Years' War, 1756 to 1763, in which Prussia became involved in a comprehensive European conflict. Frederick II was faced with an alliance that united Austria, France, Russia, and Sweden, while Prussia had only limited allies. Despite its numerical inferiority, Prussia succeeded in defending its territorial possessions and at the same time wearing down attackers through innovative strategies, rapid troop movements, precise coordination, and the use of fortresses. The war showed Prussia's ability to integrate military, economic, and diplomatic resources and to remain capable of acting despite adverse conditions.
During this period, the army became the central instrument of power, which not only achieved military successes but also ensured political stability and territorial control. The wars of the 18th century also had far-reaching economic effects. The maintenance of large standing armies required considerable resources, which were secured by taxes, trade, and economic reforms. Prussia used the income from Silesia, industry, and trade to finance the army, expand fortresses, and stabilize the administration. At the same time, infrastructure measures were implemented to improve logistics and supplies and support the economic integration of the territories. This strategic combination of economy and military allowed Prussia to wage wars for decades without endangering the internal stability of the state. Socially, the wars led to profound changes. The population was burdened by recruitment, taxes, and looting, while at the same time loyalty, a sense of duty, and identification with the state were promoted. The close connection between the army, administration, and population strengthened the centralized rule of the Hohenzollerns. Schools, churches, and public institutions were used to instill discipline, obedience, and civic values, integrating the population into the military and political organization. This social coherence was crucial in order to bear the burdens of the wars and to secure dynastic rule in the long term. Culturally, Frederick II used the wars to position Prussia as a modern, enlightened, and militarily effective power. Art, literature, and philosophy were promoted in order to convey the image of a rationally organized, disciplined, and successful state. At the same time, military successes were used for propaganda purposes to promote loyalty, pride, and social stability. The combination of military glory, cultural legitimacy, and economic stability created a coherent identity that established Prussia as the leading power in Central Europe. The Prussian wars of the 18th century demonstrate that territorial gain, military power, and political power are closely linked. Prussia was able to consolidate its position as a great power through strategic wars, skillful diplomacy, economic stability, and central administration, while at the same time creating the basis for its later rise in the European power structure. The combination of discipline, organization, and strategic foresight showed that sustainable state success is based on the integration of military, political, economic, and cultural resources. In summary, the Prussian wars of the 18th century transformed Prussia from a regional power to a recognized European great power. Through military successes, territorial expansion, economic security, and cultural legitimacy, the state was able to stabilize its internal order, consolidate dynastic rule, and lay the foundation for Prussia in the 19th century. These wars show that sustainable power development depends not only on military prowess, but on a consistent connection of all state resources, and that strategic vision, discipline, and organizational efficiency were central elements of Prussian success.
Chapter 13. Prussia in the Age of Reforms, 1806 to 1815. The period from 1806 to 1815 was a period of far-reaching reforms for Prussia, which was forced by the defeat by Napoleon and the occupation of Prussian territories. After the catastrophic Battle of Vienna and Auerstedt in 1806, in which the Prussian army was devastatingly defeated, the state was on the verge of collapse. Napoleon dictated the conditions that massively restricted Prussia's political, economic, and military structures. This shock revealed the structural weaknesses of the state, the inefficient administration, the outdated military organization, the rigid feudal structures, and the economic backwardness. The defeat made it clear that Prussia could regain neither military strength nor political stability without comprehensive reforms. The military reforms were central to the renewal of Prussia. The old, rigid structures of the army have been dissolved. Officer training has been reformed. Recruitment practices have been modernized, and discipline has been improved, taking into account individual abilities. Personalities such as Scharnhorst and Gneisenau introduced the reforms that transformed the army into a flexible, efficient, and powerful institution.
In particular, the introduction of universal conscription and the training of citizens as part of national defense revolutionized the military structure. The army became not only an instrument of defense, but also an engine of social integration and a symbol of national identity and loyalty to the state. Politically, the reforms were aimed at modernizing and centralizing the administration. Stein and Hardenberg, the important state reformers of the time, introduced measures that broke up feudal structures, streamlined administrative processes, and increased the efficiency of the state. The territorial administration was reorganized, local sovereign rights were restricted, and uniform legal standards were introduced. The aim was to strengthen the power of the central government, to secure tax collection, and to create the basis for an efficient, modernly organized state. The reforms emphasized the combination of political authority, administrative efficiency, and social stability as the basis of long-term statehood. Economically, the reforms have laid the foundations for growth and competitiveness. Peasant emancipation abolished rigid feudal structures, turning farmers into free owners or tenants who had incentives to operate more productively. Trade and commerce were liberalized, customs duties were reduced, and infrastructure measures, especially road and canal construction, were pushed forward. These economic measures strengthened the base for military financing, increased state revenues, and improved the living conditions of the population, thereby fostering loyalty and stability. The reforms showed that economic flexibility, productive use of resources, and integration into regional and international trade networks are crucial for the long-term strength of a state. Socially, the reforms led to a comprehensive reorganization of social structures. The liberation of peasants and the abolition of feudal dependencies improved individual freedom and increased social mobility. Education and training were reformed, with a focus on a sense of duty, civil rights, and national identity. The integration of different social groups into military, economic, and administrative structures created a sense of shared responsibility for the state. At the same time, the reforms strengthened loyalty to the monarchy and identification with Prussia as a national polity. The reforms also had a cultural dimension. Prussia developed a new self-image as an enlightened, rationally organized state. Educational institutions, academic institutions, and cultural support measures helped to integrate society, instill civic values, and lay the foundation for the development of a modern national consciousness. Military, political, and cultural reforms worked together to promote the emergence of a coherent, efficient state that could meet the demands of the 19th century. Prussia's foreign policy strategy during this period was closely linked to military and administrative reforms. Through skillful diplomacy, alliances, and participation in the wars of liberation against Napoleon, Prussia was able to regain its sovereignty, secure territorial integrity, and at the same time, strengthen its position within Europe. Military and administrative modernization prepared Prussia for active participation in the wars of the coalition and enabled it to play a strategic role in the Congress of Vienna, which reorganized the political order of Europe after 1815. In summary, the period from 1806 to 1815 was a transformative period for Prussia, in which military, political, economic, and social reforms laid the foundations for its later role as a European great power. The reforms forced by the defeat by Napoleon led to a modernization of the army, administration, and economy, strengthened social coherence, and enabled Prussia to establish itself as a sovereign, stable, and capable state after the coalition wars. This period clearly shows that far-reaching, coordinated reforms are necessary to meet the challenges of wars, political upheavals, and economic transformation, and to secure the long-term strength of a state.
Chapter 14. The Wars of Liberation and Prussia's Role in the Congress of Vienna, 1813 to 1815. The Wars of Liberation from 1813 to 1815 marked a decisive phase in Prussia's history, in which the state established itself as a central power in the European context and consolidated its military and political position after the defeat of Napoleon in 1806.
After years of foreign rule and Napoleonic occupation, which had placed a heavy burden on Prussia economically, administratively, and socially, the country was forced to prove its military clout, organizational efficiency, and political stability. The wars of liberation were not only military conflicts, but also an expression of Prussia's growing national identity and centralized state power, which had been decisively shaped by the reforms of Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and Stein. The military organization of Prussia had modernized considerably after the reforms in the early 19th century. The standing army was set up by universal conscription, consistent training, and strict discipline, which guaranteed a high level of operational readiness and flexibility. This troop structure allowed Prussia to conduct both defensive and offensive operations in the coalition wars against Napoleon. The army used innovative tactics, rapid mobilization, and coordinated movements to hold its own against French troops, who were often numerically superior. At the same time, military efficiency was closely linked to the administrative competence of the state, as supply, recruitment, and logistics were centrally organized, which made it possible to conduct the war at a high professional level. Politically, Prussia played a decisive role within the coalition of European powers. Through the reforms of the years after 1806, the state was able to use its influence, effectively shape diplomatic relations, and implement a coordinated war strategy with other members of the coalition such as Russia, Austria, and Great Britain. Prussia's military successes strengthened its negotiating position, while the central administration and reforms had previously made it possible to mobilize and finance the war. The wars led to a consolidation of the political power of the state by strengthening loyalty, efficiency, and coordination between the military, administration, and population. The social impact of the wars of liberation was profound. Universal conscription led to broad sections of the population being directly involved in the defense and liberation process, which strengthened national awareness and identification with the Prussian state. Military duties, patriotic appeals, and participation in joint military efforts fostered a sense of unity and loyalty. At the same time, social hierarchies were partially loosened, as talent, discipline, and commitment became more important than mere birth or status, which in the long term increased social cohesion and the effectiveness of the army. Economically, the war presented Prussia with great challenges, as supplying the army, infrastructure measures, and reparation payments required considerable resources. The government used the economic reforms of the previous decades to stabilize trade, crafts, and agriculture, secure revenues, and ensure war financing. At the same time, warfare incentivized innovation in logistics, production, and transportation, closely linking economic efficiency and military effectiveness. This economic organization was crucial to enable Prussia to operate militarily successfully while maintaining internal stability. Prussia's military successes during the Wars of Liberation set the stage for participation in the Congress of Vienna, 1814 to 1815, at which the political reorganization of Europe was decided after the defeat of Napoleon. Prussia used its military achievement, territorial gains, and diplomatic position to influence the shaping of the new political order. In particular, the annexation of territory such as the Rhineland, Westphalia, and parts of Saxony was legitimized by the military merits, whereby Prussia consolidated its position as a central power within Europe. The Congress showed that military successes, diplomatic skill, and economic stability are closely linked and form the basis for sustainable political influence. Culturally and ideologically, the Wars of Liberation contributed to the consolidation of a Prussian national identity. Patriotic appeals, military victories, and participation in the defense of the territories strengthened a sense of unity and loyalty. At the same time, social hierarchies were partially loosened, as talent, discipline, and commitment became more important than mere birth or status, which in the long term increased social cohesion and the effectiveness of the army. Economically, the war presented Prussia with great challenges, as supplying the army, infrastructure measures, and reparation payments required considerable resources. The government used the economic reforms of the previous decades to stabilize trade, crafts, and agriculture, secure revenues, and ensure war financing. At the same time, warfare incentivized innovation in logistics, production, and transportation, closely linking economic efficiency and military effectiveness. This economic organization was crucial to enable Prussia to operate militarily successfully while maintaining internal stability. Prussia's military successes during the Wars of Liberation set the stage for participation in the Congress of Vienna, 1814 to 1815, at which the political reorganization of Europe was decided after the defeat of Napoleon. Prussia used its military achievement, territorial gains, and diplomatic position to influence the shaping of the new political order. In particular, the annexation of territories such as the Rhineland, Westphalia, and parts of Saxony was legitimized by the military merits, whereby Prussia consolidated its position as a central power within Europe. The Congress showed that military successes, diplomatic skill, and economic stability are closely linked and form the basis for sustainable political influence. Culturally and ideologically, the Wars of Liberation contributed to the consolidation of a Prussian national consciousness. Patriotic appeals, military victories, and joint participation in the defense of the territories strengthened the sense of unity and loyalty. At the same time, education, the press, and public celebrations were used to promote loyalty to the state, military discipline, and identification with Prussian institutions. The wars thus supported not only military and political consolidation, but also social integration and Prussia's cultural self-image. In summary, it can be said that the Wars of Liberation from 1813 to 1815 decisively strengthened Prussia. Military reforms, central administration, economic stability, and social coherence made it possible to wage war effectively and restore territorial and political sovereignty. The successes on the battlefield gave Prussia a significant position at the Congress of Vienna, securing territorial expansion, political recognition, and long-term strategic advantages. This phase clearly shows that sustainable power development is based on the integration of the military, politics, economy, administration, and social identity, and that Prussia's rise to become a Central European power is closely linked to the reforms and military achievements of these years.
Chapter 15. Prussia in the Vormärz and Industrialization. The period of the Vormärz in the 19th century, roughly between 1815 and 1848, was a phase of profound social, economic, and political changes for Prussia, which initiated the transition from a feudal agrarian state to a modernized, industrialized nation. After the reforms of the Liberation period and the territorial changes of the Congress of Vienna, Prussia was politically stable, had a centralized administration, and a disciplined army. Nevertheless, the state faced new challenges. The population grew, cities expanded, and the economic demands of emerging industrialization required innovation, investment, and structural adjustment. The Vormärz was thus characterized by an interaction of economic change, social transformation, and political pressure, with Prussia laying the foundations for modern state development. Economically, industrialization in Prussia initially began in the cities and along rivers and transport routes, which served as the logistical lifelines of the new economy. Factories for textiles, mechanical engineering, and metalworking were established, supported by the availability of raw materials from Silesia, Westphalia, and the Ruhr area. The infrastructure was systematically expanded. Roads, railways, and canals connected production, cities, and markets, and enabled a more efficient distribution of goods and resources. This economic development increased productivity, strengthened trade and commerce, and made a significant contribution to the financing of state tasks such as administration and military security.
Prussia increasingly developed into an industrially and technologically advanced state, which laid the foundations for later economic dominance in Central Europe. Parallel to economic modernization, a transformation of social structures took place. The growing urban population, consisting of industrial workers, merchants, and craftsmen, led to greater social differentiation. While traditional agrarian society continued to dominate, new social strata emerged, defined by access to education, division of labor, and economic activity. The emerging bourgeoisie increasingly developed political awareness, demanded a say, and the opportunity to participate in economic and administrative decisions. At the same time, the traditional elites, including the nobility and civil servants, had to redefine their role within a changing state, with loyalty, efficiency, and education increasingly becoming decisive criteria for social positioning. Politically, the Vormärz was characterized by growing pressure for reforms and liberalization. The population demanded more co-determination, freedom of the press, the rule of law, and political participation. Despite the centralized administration and strict control by the monarchy, liberal currents and political associations set accents that challenged the state and highlighted the need for reform. The Prussian state reacted selectively to these developments by allowing partial reforms, addressing social tensions, and at the same time maintaining military and administrative order. This balance between authoritarian control and limited reforms determined the political culture of Prussia in the Vormärz and laid the foundation for the later developments of 1848. The military structure also played a central role in this phase. The army remained a central instrument of power projection, internal security, and the enforcement of state interests. At the same time, it served as a mobilization apparatus that also brought logistical and organizational experience to the administration and economic development. The linking of military organization, administration, and economic planning demonstrated that military discipline and state efficiency were closely linked and crucial to the stability of the changing state. Education and science were also specifically promoted in order to meet the requirements of industrialization. Schools, technical academies, and universities trained qualified workers who were needed for both administration and industry. Technical knowledge, scientific knowledge, and organizational skills were systematically imparted, which enabled the state to secure its economic and administrative capacity in the long term. These educational measures contributed not only to economic modernization, but also to social integration and the legitimation of central rule, as qualified citizens increasingly took on responsibility and were thus integrated into state structures. The social tensions caused by industrialization, urbanization, and political demands led to the first political movements, labor organizations, and liberal reform initiatives. These developments forced the Prussian state to develop new mechanisms of control, integration, and regulation. The police, administration, and military worked closely together to ensure public order, while at the same time reforms were implemented in the areas of property law, freedom of trade, and municipal administration. These adjustments demonstrated Prussia's ability to respond flexibly to social and economic challenges while maintaining central control. In summary, it can be said that the Vormärz and the early industrialization of Prussia represented a phase of transformation and modernization. Economic innovation, infrastructural expansion, social differentiation, political demands, and military stability all worked together to create a modern state capable of acting. During this time, Prussia laid the foundations for its later economic, military, and political dominance in Central Europe. Experience has shown that sustainable state strength is based on the integration of economic efficiency, administrative competence, military organization, and social adaptability. This phase was crucial in preparing Prussia for the political and social challenges of the 19th century and paving the way for the revolutionary events of 1848 and the subsequent unification of Germany.
Chapter 16. The Revolution of 1848 and the Political Development of Prussia.
The Revolution of 1848 in Prussia was a drastic event that had a lasting influence on the political, social, and economic development of the country. It was part of the Europe-wide revolutions of the Vormärz, in which citizens, workers, intellectuals, and parts of the liberal nobility demanded political participation, freedom of the press, the rule of law, and social reforms. The causes of the uprising were manifold: growing dissatisfaction with authoritarian monarchical rule, social tensions as a result of industrialization, the economic burden of low wages and rising prices, and the increasing political mobilization of citizens. Prussia, which had developed into a centralized and efficient state after the years of liberation and reform in the early 19th century, was now faced with the challenge of reconciling these far-reaching social demands with the monarchical order. The revolution began in March 1848 with uprisings in Berlin, which quickly spread to other cities and regions. Citizens and students organized demonstrations, initially aimed at liberal reforms, while workers and craftsmen demanded social justice and better working conditions. This movement showed the tensions between the old feudal structures, the not yet fully integrated industrial society, and the centralized state power. The rule of the Hohenzollerns was directly challenged as the population demanded the introduction of constitutions, the expansion of political rights, and the limitation of the king's absolute authority. The revolution made it clear that political stability could not be maintained by military strength and administrative efficiency alone, but that social legitimacy and political participation were increasingly becoming central factors. King Frederick William IV initially reacted with concessions by convening a national assembly and allowing a Prussian constitution to be drafted. These steps were intended to pacify the liberal demands, but at the same time stabilize monarchical control and the dynasty. The Prussian National Assembly, which was partly prepared in the Paulskirche project in Frankfurt, was a forum in which liberal and conservative forces met. The debates reflected the complex political landscape. Citizens demanded participation, freedom of the press, and an end to censorship, while conservative forces defended monarchical authority and emphasized social order as a prerequisite for stability. The revolution thus not only offered the opportunity for political reforms, but also made visible the existing contradictions between social modernization, economic development, and authoritarian rule. Militarily, the army remained a decisive authority during the revolution. During the uprising in Berlin and other cities, the army was used to maintain public order and suppress armed unrest. At the same time, it became clear that military efficiency alone was not enough to overcome social tensions, as the demands for political reforms were deeply rooted and met with broad support among the population. The role of the army made clear the central importance of a monopoly on the use of force, loyalty, and strategic decision-making in a state that had to balance between reforms and conservative stability. The revolution also had an economically and socially stabilizing effect by increasing the pressure for reforms. Trade, commerce, and industry had to adapt to the political uncertainties, while workers and the urban population were given a stronger voice on social issues. The introduction of working time regulations, improved conditions for craftsmen, and the promotion of educational initiatives were direct or indirect consequences of the revolutionary movement. This showed that economic development and social stability are closely linked, and that political reforms are not only symbolic but practical in nature for the functioning of the state. The cultural dimension of the Revolution of 1848 was also decisive. Freedom of the press, political associations, educational initiatives, and public debates strengthened political participation, awareness of rights, and duties within society. Intellectuals, journalists, and teachers contributed to ensuring that the demands for political participation and social reforms did not remain isolated but could be implemented in social reality. Education and public discussion became tools that promoted both political legitimacy and social integration.
Although the immediate goals of the revolution were partially limited by military repression and political compromise, it left a long-term mark on Prussia. The events showed that authoritarian rule, military power, and administrative efficiency are not enough to stabilize a state in the long term. They laid the foundation for later constitutions, the integration of bourgeois classes into the political process, and the systematic modernization of administration, business, and education. The Revolution of 1848 was thus a catalyst for the political, social, and cultural development of Prussia, which paved the way for later modernization, its role in the German Confederation, and its positioning in a united Germany. In summary, the Revolution of 1848 positioned Prussia at a turning point between authoritarian tradition and modern society. It revealed the tensions between absolutist monarchy, social differentiation, economic modernization, and the political aspirations of the population. The events led to reforms, the strengthening of national identity, the integration of various social groups, and the long-term stabilization of Prussian state power. This period demonstrated that sustainable political development is based on the balance between authority, participation, economic efficiency, and social coherence, and that Prussia was better prepared for the challenges of the later 19th century through this experience.
Chapter 17, Bismarck and the Unification of Germany, 1862 to 1871. The era of Otto von Bismarck, who had a decisive influence on Prussian and German politics from 1862 to 1890, was a decisive phase in the transformation of Prussia from a centralized regional power to a leading player in Europe and the driving force of German unification. Bismarck, a convinced realpolitiker, took over the office of Prussian Prime Minister at a time marked by internal tensions, regional conflicts, and the desire for national consolidation. His goal was clear. Prussia was to take on the leading role within Germany, secure political stability, and achieve German unity under Prussian dominance through a skillful combination of diplomacy, military strength, and domestic political reforms. Politically, Bismarck relied on the strategic use of power and influence to overcome both internal and external challenges. Within Prussia, he worked to strengthen the central authority of the crown, consolidate the administration, and control the influence of the state parliament. At the same time, he took advantage of the tensions between various German states to assert Prussia's interests and secure the territorial and political position of the kingdom in the German Confederation. Bismarck's policies were shaped by the idea that national unity could be achieved not through liberal discussions, but through strategic power projection, skillful wars, and diplomatic alliances. Militarily, Bismarck benefited from the professional, disciplined, and modernized Prussian army, which had been systematically built up since Frederick William I and Frederick II. The army was the central instrument for achieving political goals, defeating external opponents, and strengthening Prussia's position within Germany. The use of military power was carefully planned. Bismarck combined offensive campaigns with diplomatic initiatives to maximize the political benefits of military successes. The three decisive wars under his aegis, the German-Danish War of 1864, the German War against Austria in 1866, and the Franco-German War of 1870-1871, demonstrated the close connection between military clout, strategic planning, and political success. The German-Danish War of 1864 served as a prelude to Bismarck's strategy of territorial expansion and securing power. Prussia and Austria fought together against Denmark to conquer the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein. The military successes not only enabled territorial gains, but also strengthened Prussia's position within the German Confederation and demonstrated the ability to combine military operations with diplomatic objectives. Schleswig and Holstein became the bargaining chip between Prussia and Austria, which paved the way for the next step in Bismarck's plan for German unification. The German War of 1866 against Austria was the decisive conflict that established Prussia's leading role in Germany. Bismarck diplomatically isolated Austria by forming alliances with smaller German states and neutralizing France, while the Prussian army used superior strategy, mobility, and discipline. The military successes led to the dissolution of the German Confederation and the founding of the North German Confederation under Prussian leadership. Politically, this was a triumphant step. Prussia now controlled the central structures, was able to dominate the administration and military organization, and lay the foundation for a later all-German unity. Finally, the Franco-German War of 1870–1871 was the culmination of Bismarck's strategy. Through clever provocation and diplomatic manipulation, he triggered the war with France, which promoted national cohesion and patriotic feelings within the German states. The military victories of Prussia and its allies led to the capitulation of France, the annexation of Alsace-Lorraine, and the founding of the German Empire in 1871. Wilhelm I was proclaimed German emperor, while Bismarck ensured Prussian dominance within the new Reich as Reichschancellor. The unification of Germany under Prussian leadership was not only the military and diplomatic triumph, but also the result of consistent domestic policy, economic integration, and strategic foresight. Economically, the industrialization of Prussia played a central role. Efficient administration, infrastructure development, railway expansion, and industrialization made it possible to move troops quickly, supply the army, and mobilize the population. Economic stability and industrial capacity thus became the basis for military and political successes. At the same time, the economic upswing contributed to social integration and the legitimacy of the Prussian leadership, as prosperity and infrastructure projects strengthened the acceptance of centralized power. Socially, Bismarck's policies led to the strengthening of loyalty to the Prussian crown and the new German unity. Military successes, national symbols, patriotic propaganda, and the integration of various German states into a common political system strengthened identification with Prussia as the leading power and created an awareness of the common national identity. At the same time, conservative structures were preserved, which ensured the stability of the Reich and helped to overcome the revolutionary movements of the Vormärz. In summary, the Bismarck era transformed Prussia from a regional power to a central power in Germany and laid the foundation for the founding of the German Empire. By combining military strength, strategic diplomacy, economic stability, and social integration, Bismarck was able to establish Prussia as a leading power and enforce German unification under Prussian dominance. The events of these years demonstrate that sustainable state success is based on the integration of military, political, economic, and social efficiency, and that strategic foresight, organizational discipline, and consistent implementation are crucial for the long-term dominance of a great power.
Chapter 18: The German Empire and Prussia Supremacy. With the founding of the German Empire in 1871, Prussia entered a new phase of its history, in which it dominated as the leading power within a united Germany. Prussia's central position was the result of centuries of political, military, and administrative consolidation, culminating in Bismarck's policies and wars of unification. Prussia not only provided the Kaiser, Wilhelm I, and the Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, but also dominated the political system of the empire through the Prussian military power, administration, and economic infrastructure. This dominance had a lasting impact on the political structures, military organization, and social dynamics of the new empire, and established Prussia as a central institution in Germany. Politically, Prussia's supremacy in the empire was secured by its dominant position in the Bundesrat and control over the military and administrative structures. The Prussian king also became German emperor, which symbolized and practically manifested Prussia's dynastic authority and political power over the other German states. The Prussian constitution, administration, and jurisdiction were used as a model at the imperial level, with Prussia setting the standards that were adopted or adapted for other federal states. This central position enabled Prussia to significantly influence political decisions, steer legislative processes, and determine the strategic direction of the empire. Militarily, Prussia used its long tradition of a professional, disciplined, and modern army to ensure the security of the empire and consolidate its leadership role. The Prussian army, which had been continuously developed since Frederick William I and Frederick the Great, formed the backbone of the Reich's defense. It served not only to provide external protection against European powers, but also to control within the Reich, to maintain order, and to enforce state decisions. The military structure was closely linked to administration, infrastructure, and economic planning, which ensured efficiency and effectiveness in the long term. Economically, Prussia benefited from its leading role in the empire. The industrially advanced Prussia, with its well-developed infrastructure, railways, canals, and industrial centers, became the economic engine of the empire. Trade, production, and finance were highly centralized and networked with the Prussian administrative structures, which allowed resources to be efficiently mobilized and distributed. Prussia's economic strength not only secured its military clout, but also allowed investments in education, science, and infrastructure, which stabilized the empire as a whole. The industrial boom contributed to social integration and consolidated the legitimacy of Prussia's leadership role within Germany. Socially, Prussia's dominance was closely linked to the strengthening of loyalty, order, and discipline. The military, administration, and business were interlinked, which involved the population in a system of duties and rights. Compulsory military service, central administration, and economic demands structured the lives of citizens and created a coherent social structure. At the same time, education, science, and cultural institutions were specifically promoted in order to train specialists, strengthen political loyalty, and promote a common national consciousness. Prussia used these mechanisms to secure its political and social dominance in the empire. Culturally and ideologically, Prussia played a central role in the formation of a national identity. Prussian education, administration, and military organization served as a model for other federal states. Values such as discipline, a sense of duty, loyalty, and obedience to state authority were taught and consolidated the social order. At the same time, the cultural diversity of the empire was channeled through integration into central institutions, creating a sense of shared identity that supported the stability of Prussian domination. The foreign policy of the German Empire was decisively shaped by Prussia's strategic interests. Its military strength, economic performance, and central political position enabled the Reich to forge diplomatic relations, form alliances, and secure territorial interests in Europe. Prussia's dominance meant that decisions about war, peace, and international relations were heavily influenced by the strategies and interests of the Prussian government. This control at the foreign policy level was a decisive factor in stabilizing the central position of power in the long term. In summary, Prussia's dominance in the German Empire was not only based on military power, but was achieved through the integration of politics, economy, administration, society, and culture. Prussia's central position in the empire had a lasting impact on its political structure, military organization, economic development, and social identity. This phase shows that sustainable state success is based on the close link between power projection, administrative efficiency, economic strength, and social coherence. Prussia's dominance in the empire was thus the result of centuries of strategic planning, reforms, and continuous integration of the military, administration, and population, making the state a central leader within Germany and Europe.
Chapter 19. Prussia in the First World War, 1914–1918. The First World War presented Prussia, embedded in the German Empire, with immense challenges that put political, military, economic, and social structures to the test. As the dominant power within the empire, Prussia bore the brunt of mobilization, warfare, and resource management. Prussia's already highly centralized bureaucracy, efficient military organization, and economic infrastructure were now converted to maximum use for warfare. At the same time, the war revealed the strengths and weaknesses of the Prussian state. Military discipline, administrative efficiency, and the ability to mobilize were contrasted with an increasing burden on the population, economic bottlenecks, and political tensions. Militarily, Prussia was the decisive force within the German army. The Prussian traditions of discipline, organization, and strategic thinking that had developed since Frederick William I and Frederick the Great formed the basis for the military efficiency of the empire. The army was well structured, trained, and able to mobilize large numbers of troops, which led to successes on the western and eastern fronts in the first months of the war. Nevertheless, the war also showed the limits of traditional warfare, as modern weapons, mass combat, industrial production of ammunition, and logistics over long distances posed new demands that could not be met without adaptation. The political leadership of Prussia and the German Empire was closely linked. As the dominant part of the empire, Prussia exerted a significant influence on war strategy, political mobilization, and internal reforms. The Prussian administration coordinated the mobilization of soldiers, the organization of war production, and the maintenance of order at home. At the same time, political pressure increased as the population became increasingly dissatisfied under the stresses of war, supply bottlenecks, and social tensions. Political stability depended on a close connection between authority, administration, and social loyalty, which was increasingly put to the test in the course of the war. Economically, Prussia was centrally responsible for supplying the army and maintaining the infrastructure. Industrial production, the transport of raw materials, and the feeding of the population were strictly organized, with rationed distributions, war bonds, and state control of production and trade being introduced. The strain on the economy due to material consumption, inflation, and blockades led to bottlenecks, which in turn increased social discontent and political tensions. Prussia's economic ability to cope with these demands was crucial for the continuation of the war effort, but it also showed that long-standing economic strength can be massively endangered by long-term conflicts. Socially, the war was a time of extreme stress for Prussia. Hundreds of thousands of men were drafted, rural and urban families were under pressure, and the supply of food, coal, and other basic necessities became increasingly difficult. At the same time, patriotic cohesion was formed, supported by propaganda, associations, and organizations that coordinated military, economic, and social mobilization. Nevertheless, protests, strikes, and political movements demanding reforms and an end to the burdens grew over the course of the war years, which increasingly endangered the stability of the Prussian administration and the authority of the monarchy. The military events of the war had a direct influence on the political and social situation. Initial successes on the Western Front, the massive mobilization on the Eastern Front, and the war experiences of the population briefly strengthened loyalty to the state. With the ongoing war, high casualties, stagnating fronts, and material shortages, dissatisfaction increased. The link between military deployment, administrative organization, and social loyalty were strained, and the question of reforms, parliamentary participation, and political participation came to the fore. Culturally and ideologically, the war was used to motivate the population and strengthen cohesion. Propaganda, patriotic speeches, publications, and public events conveyed the image of a united Prussia within the empire, which was responsible and obliged to the state and the nation. Education and the media were used to promote loyalty, obedience, and a sense of duty, which in the short term strengthened cohesion, but in the long term was shaken by losses and lack of supplies. The war years 1914 to 1918 showed that Prussia's dominance within the German Empire was being put to the test. Military efficiency, administrative competence, economic organization, and social integration were crucial to waging the war, but the stresses led to political tensions, social protests, and ultimately revolutionary movements at the end of the war. The experience of these years demonstrated that the long-term stability of a state cannot be guaranteed by military clout and administrative discipline alone, but also depends on social acceptance, economic resilience, and political adaptability. In summary, it can be said that Prussia fulfilled its role as a leading component of the German Empire during the First World War, but at the same time reached the limits of its capacity. Military, political, economic, and social structures were put to the maximum and put to the test. The war years led to short-term successes and long-term challenges that paved the way for the end of the empire and the beginning of a new political order. Prussia's performance in war, but also the limits of the old structures, show that the integration of military discipline, economic performance, political control, and social cohesion is crucial for the continued existence of a state, especially in times of massive external and internal stress.
Chapter 20. The Dissolution of Prussia and the Aftermath in the 20th Century. The dissolution of Prussia after World War I marked the end of a centuries-long political and territorial experiment, marking the transition from a dominant European power to a fragmented political space within the Weimar Republic. After the defeat of the German Empire in 1918, the collapse of the monarchy and the revolution in Germany, Prussia was severely shaken politically and administratively. Prussia's centuries-long central position within the empire was now called into question, and its institutions, military traditions, and administrative systems lost their dominant status. The Treaty of Versailles and the political upheavals of the Weimar Republic led to a new order that significantly reduced Prussia's influence and created new challenges for the integration of the population and the stabilization of the country. Politically, Prussia became part of the Weimar Republic after the First World War and was given the status of a state within the federal system. The old monarchical order was abolished, the Prussian royal title no longer existed, and the central power of the state was replaced by democratic structures. New constitutions, elected parliaments, and prime ministers replaced centuries of dynastic rule. The administration had to adapt to democratic processes, while at the same time there was pressure to ensure social, economic, and political stability at a time of significant uncertainty. This transformation was complex, as the population was accustomed to centuries of authority, hierarchical structures, and military discipline, while parliamentary participation, political participation, and the rule of law were now the foundations of legitimacy. Militarily, the end of the empire and the monarchical order meant a drastic reduction in the army. The Prussian military tradition, which had been built up and refined since Frederick William I and Frederick the Great, was dissolved or severely restricted. The Treaty of Versailles set upper limits for troop strength, armament, and military infrastructure, which finally ended Prussia's military dominance. These changes led to tensions within the population, especially among former officers and military personnel who perceived the disempowerment of the army as a loss of status, influence, and identity. At the same time, the new military order required adaptation to democratic and civilian control, which led to conflicts between tradition and the modern rule of law. Economically, Prussia faced considerable challenges during the Weimar Republic. The loss of territory, reparation payments, inflation, and the aftermath of the war put a massive strain on the economy. Industries, trade, and infrastructure had to be reorganized, while at the same time, social support, jobs, and stability had to be guaranteed. Prussia, as the economically strong heart of the former empire, nevertheless played a central role in the consolidation of the Weimar Republic. The administration, long known for efficiency and centralized control, now had to operate under democratic and federal conditions, balancing economic efficiency and political legitimacy. Socially, the dissolution of Prussia led to far-reaching changes. The population had to get used to new political structures, while old social hierarchies, which were strongly tied to the military, nobility, and administration, were lost. The introduction of democratic institutions, civil rights, and co-determination required adaptation and integration, which were supported by education, participation, and the media. At the same time, tensions remained between conservative, monarchist-oriented circles and new liberal or socialist currents, which strained political stability in the early Weimar Republic. Culturally and ideologically, the end of Prussia meant a reassessment of tradition, identity, and political legitimacy. Prussian values such as discipline, a sense of duty, and loyalty were now transferred into a democratic context, whereby new forms of national identity had to emerge. Education, cultural institutions, and the media played a central role in conveying these values and in integrating the population into the new Republican order.
At the same time, the memory of the Prussian tradition remained present as a symbol of order, efficiency, and military strength, which generated both positive opportunities for identification and nostalgic recourse in conservative circles. The aftermath of the dissolution of Prussia had an impact far beyond the immediate political transformation. The federal structure of the Weimar Republic, the territorial reorganization, and the limitation of Prussia's military power influenced political, economic development, and social integration for decades. At the same time, Prussia's administrative tradition, which embodied efficiency, order, and centralization, laid the foundation for reforms and structures that continue to have an impact in the Federal Republic of Germany in the later 20th century. In summary, the dissolution of Prussia after the First World War marked the end of centuries of dominance, but at the same time prepared the transition to new political, economic, and social structures. The transformation from a monarchical order to a federal democratic structure required adjustments at all levels. Administration, military, economy, and society had to be brought into harmony in order to ensure stability and the ability to act. The aftermath of this phase showed that Prussia's historical significance lay not only in territorial or military power, but also in the tradition of administration, discipline, and efficiency that was transferred to the new political order. The experiences of these years shaped Germany's political culture, influenced the Weimar Republic, and left long-term traces in administration, the military, and society that continued into the 20th century.